Alright, let's go. Number 10, Jehu. In November 1846, Austin Henry Layard was excavating through the rubble of the Northwest Palace at Nimrud, ancient Kalhu, the administrative capital of the Assyrian Empire, when his workers uncovered the upper edge of a large dark stone. Layard cleared it himself. The surface was basalt, still polished in places where centuries of dry Mesopotamian soil had sealed it against the air. As the surrounding debris came away, the full object emerged, a four-sided monolith, 2 meters tall, carved on every face with horizontal registers of tribute processions. The figures were intact. The inscriptions running above each register were crisp enough to read with a lamp. The black obelisk of Shalmaneser III had been in the ground for approximately 3,000 years. What the cuneiform caption above the second register's central figure would eventually be translated to say, however, would take another decade to confirm, and the confirmation would raise as many questions as it answered. The obelisk records the tribute campaigns of Shalmaneser III, king of Assyria, from 858 to 824 BCE. Across its 5 carved registers, delegations from 5 subjugated nations kneel and prostrate, carrying tribute. The second register shows a bearded figure bent double in the full prostration posture face toward the ground, arms extended with a line of attendants behind him, bearing goods. Above the scene, the cuneiform caption identifies the figure and names his kingdom. Henry Rawlinson, the leading cuneiformist of the era, published the translation. The kneeling figure was identified as Iawa of the House of Omri. Ea Amt Umri, the king of the northern Israelite state. The biblical identification followed immediately. The northern Israelite king who paid tribute to Shalmaneser III in the 840s BC was Jehu. 2 Kings chapter 9 and 10 describe his revolt against the Omride dynasty, his killing of King Joram son of Ahab, his killing of Queen Jezebel, his systematic elimination of the house of Omri from the Israelite throne. Jehu is the anti-Omride king. His entire reign begins with the destruction of everything Omri built. The image on the obelisk is the only surviving visual representation of a named Israelite or Judean king produced within their own lifetime. Jehu reigned approximately 841 to 814 BCE. The obelisk records his tribute within those decades. The figure kneeling on the black stone is, by every evidentiary measure available, the only time in the ancient world that a Hebrew king's face was carved. But here's where the evidentiary record becomes genuinely unsettling. The Assyrian caption calls Jehu of the house of Omri the same dynasty he murdered to seize power. Shalmaneser III's scribes used House of Omri as their standard administrative designation for the northern Israelite kingdom, regardless of which dynasty sat on its throne. The man who killed Omri's descendants was cataloged in the Assyrian administrative system under Omri's name. The biblical account's emphasis on Jehu's anti-Omride, violence the lengths to which the text goes to establish the break, appears in Assyrian records as a distinction that didn't register. Both records agree. Jehu was real, he was king, he paid tribute to Assyria. They disagree on what mattered about him. The historiographical tension between those two priorities is not a discrepancy. It is a window into how ancient records functioned. Assyrian annals were administrative and propagandistic documents records maintained for royal prestige and imperial management. The designation House of Omri for the northern Israelite kingdom had been standard Assyrian administrative practice since Omri's reign. It was a geographic political category, not a dynastic endorsement. For Shalmaneser III's scribes, who Jehu was within Israelite internal politics was irrelevant. What the Assyrian record required was the territory he represented and the tribute he delivered. The biblical text records Jehu's revolt as a theological event, the fulfillment of Elijah's prophecy, the end of the Baal cult's patronage at the Israelite court, the punishment of Ahab's house for Naboth's blood. 2 Kings chapters 9 and 10 devote extensive space to the mechanics of Jehu's coup, the specific deaths of the Omride kings and their associates, the demolition of the Baal temple. The theological significance is the point of the record. The Assyrian administrative categories were irrelevant to it. What the identification of as Jehu also required, and what took years to settle after Layard's excavation, was the transliteration, the matching of an Assyrian cuneiform, rendering to a Hebrew royal name. The phonological case, developed through the work of Rawlinson and Norris in the following decade, established that the cuneiform fits the Hebrew ye precisely. The combination of the chronological match Jehu's reign, approximately 841 to 814 BCE, overlapping exactly with Shalmaneser III's tribute period, the geographic designation, and the phonological analysis converges on a single identification without remaining ambiguity. The black obelisk stands in room 6 of the British Museum. In the second register, on the second panel, a bearded figure is still pressing his face toward the ground. He has been bowing for approximately 2,850 years. Number 9. Shoshank I. In 1904, Gottlieb Schumacher, a German-American architect and archaeologist directing excavations at Megiddo on behalf of the Deutsche Orient Gesellschaft, was working through a destruction layer at the northern edge of the site when workers uncovered a fragment of dark stone approximately 30 centimeters at its longest surviving dimension. The inscribed face was still smooth. It had been protected from weathering by the collapsed debris above it. Schumacher could make out a cartouche, an oval hieroglyphic frame enclosing a royal name. The stele fragment's significance would not fully emerge until compared with a monument on a different continent, built by the same king for the same campaign. The fragment bore the cartouche of Shoshank I, pharaoh of Egypt's 22nd dynasty, who ruled from approximately 945 to 924 BCE. The identification was unambiguous. Shoshank had erected a victory stele at Megiddo, a monument to commemorate a specific military action at a specific place. Victory steles were not placed at home. They were placed at the site of the conquest. At Karnak, on the exterior south wall of the Great Temple complex, the Bubastite portal carries a relief commissioned by Shoshank I after his return from Palestine. It is a catalogue of conquest, 156 cartouches arranged in 2 registers, each cartouche naming a city he captured in his campaign. The list includes Megiddo, Tanakh, Beth Shean, Gibeon, Aijalon, and dozens of other sites spread across the territories of ancient Israel and Judah. The cartouches are positioned beneath the outstretched arm of a colossal relief of Shoshank himself, presenting captive enemies to the god Amun. Kings chapter 14 verses 25 and 26 record that in the 5th year of King Rehoboam of Judah, approximately 925 BC, Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem and took the treasures of the temple and the treasures of the king's house. Every object made of gold, the text says. Shishak, the Hebrew transliteration of an Egyptian royal name, Shoshink. The dates converge at precisely the period 1 Kings 14 describes. Shoshank III's campaign is generally dated to approximately 925 BC. The 5th year of Rehoboam falls within his reign. The Karnak relief lists cities across the region, the biblical text places under his campaign. And the Megiddo fragment confirms he was not simply recording a campaign from a distance. He erected a monument at Megiddo. He was there. But here's where the standard explanation runs into a complication. The Karnak list does not name Jerusalem directly. The specific column that should contain a reference to the Judean capital is damaged or absent, and scholars have debated for decades whether Shoshank III's campaign actually reached the city or whether 1 Kings 14 records a tribute payment that averted a siege rather than a completed conquest. The Karnak list, on its own, cannot confirm what happened at Jerusalem specifically. What it cannot be made to say is that Shoshank III did not campaign in the region. The stele fragment at Megiddo eliminates that possibility entirely. A pharaoh does not ship a basalt monument to a site he never visited. The physical object was placed there, in the destruction layer of the city, at the correct stratum, in the correct century. The Megiddo stele is not a record of a campaign. It is a product of the campaign itself. The destruction layer at Megiddo has its own testimony. Stratum VB shows evidence of burning and abandonment consistent with military destruction, The level above it, stratum VA-IVB, shows a rebuilt city with a different architectural character. The stele was found in the destruction layer. Its presence there, combined with the Karnak relief's listing of Megiddo among the conquered cities and the physical destruction visible in the excavated earth, provides three independent lines of evidence for the same campaign: the monument naming the site, the monument placed at the site, and the archaeological record of its destruction. The convergence is material, not interpretive. What the Shoshenq case also establishes is the mechanism by which Egyptian and Israelite records can diverge without either being false. The Karnak relief served political and theological purposes to demonstrate Shoshenq's martial achievement before the god Amun, to establish his legitimacy as a conqueror in the tradition of Egypt's great military pharaohs. The record in 1 Kings served a different purpose, to explain why the temple treasures were gone, in a theological framework where that loss carried specific meaning about divine sanction and royal failure. Both accounts are partial, neither is fabricated. The pharaoh in the Karnak cartouches is the same man whose monument was found in the Megiddo destruction layer, at the correct site, in the correct stratum. The Megiddo stele fragment sits in the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem. The Bubastite portal at Karnak still carries its 156 cartouches. A fragment of dark basalt in a Jerusalem museum case and a temple wall in Luxor, separated by 3,000 kilometers, both recording the same military movement through the same geography in the same century. Number 8. Tiglath-Pileser III. In the winter of 1845, Austin Henry Layard arrived at Nimrud for his first major excavation. He was 29 years old and working without institutional backing, with borrowed money and a small local workforce. Within days, he had uncovered the corner of a structure that turned out to be the northwest palace of Ashur-Nisirpal II. Within weeks, he had exposed rooms lined from floor to ceiling with inscribed limestone slabs, hundreds of cuneiform tablets recording the campaigns, building programs, and administrative actions of Assyria's kings. It was one of the largest archives of primary source historical documentation ever excavated. Most of its contents were shipped to the British Museum. Among the inscriptions recovered over the following decade, including material from subsequent seasons by Layard and by Hormuzd-Rassam, were the annals of Tiglath-Pileser III, king of Assyria, from 744 to 727 BCE. The annals are fragmentary and distributed across multiple museums, but they are sufficiently complete to be translated and cross-referenced. Chaim Tadmor of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem spent decades reconstructing them. His 1994 publication, The Inscriptions of Tiglath-Pileser III, King of Assyria, is the standard scholarly text. 3 entries in the annals name specific biblical figures. The first, a tribute list from approximately 738 BC, identifies a king among those paying tribute to Assyria as Menahem of Samaria. The biblical text in 2 Kings chapter 15 verses 19 and 20 records that Pul, king of Assyria, Pul being Tiglath-Pileser III's Babylonian throne name, invaded Israel during Menahem's reign, and Menahem paid him 1,000 talents of silver to withdraw. The annals confirm this transaction from the Assyrian side. The second, a different entry records that the king of Israel, Pekah, was removed from his throne and replaced by Hoshea. The Assyrian scribes record this as an administrative action by Tiglath-Pileser. 2 Kings chapter 15 verses 29 and 30 describe Hoshea son of Elah conspiring against Pekah and killing him. The Assyrian record presents the same transfer of power from a different institutional perspective. The third, a tribute list from the same period identifies Ea-Uhazi of Ea-U-da-Jehoahaz of Judah, whose full name is rendered in the biblical text as Ahaz among the vassal kings paying tribute to Assyria. 2 Kings chapter 16 verses 7 through 10 describe Ahaz sending tribute to Tiglath-Pileser and requesting his military assistance against the allied kings of Israel and Syria. 3 separate biblical figures. 2 kingdoms. A single Assyrian monarch's administrative records. Menahem, Pekah, and Ahaz appear not in a single inscription, but across multiple documents tribute lists, campaign records, administrative replacements, each naming a specific king performing a specific action in a specific political context that corresponds with a biblical account of the same event. Consider the implication. The critical argument most commonly deployed against the historicity of the biblical monarchic period is the absence of external corroboration. The kings of Israel and Judah, in this view, are literary constructions of a later period. But Tiglath-Pileser III's administrative records name 3 of them individually not as legendary rulers, but as tribute payers, military adversaries, and replaced client kings whose successors were installed by Assyrian administrative action. The same window of 2 Kings 15 and 16 that records Menahem, Pekah, and Ahaz is now externally corroborated by 3 separate classes of Assyrian document. This is not one confirmation. It is a simultaneous triple attestation from the administrative files of their most powerful neighbor. What the standard explanation cannot resolve is the texture of the corroboration. Each piece is individually explainable. What is not individually explainable is the convergence, 3 different figures, in the same 2-decade window, each confirmed in the records of the single king whose interactions with Israel and Judah the biblical text specifically describes. There is also the question of textual specificity that the standard critical argument tends to pass over. The biblical text in 2 Kings 15 identifies Tiglath-Pileser by both his regnal name and his Babylonian throne name, Pul, within the same passage. Some 19th century scholars treated the dual designation as an error or a conflation of 2 different rulers. The Assyrian records established definitively that Pul and Tiglath-Pileser III were the same person, the same king, using different names in different administrative contexts. His Assyrian name in the west and his Babylonian throne name in Mesopotamia. The biblical text had preserved both names and associated them correctly with the same ruler. The specific mechanism described in 2 Kings 15:29-30, by which Tiglath-Pileser removed Pekah and installed Hoshea, is also worth reading against the Assyrian account directly. The biblical text implies Assyrian initiative, Tiglath-Pileser acts, and Hoshea is installed. The Assyrian annals record the same causal structure: the removal of an unfavorable client king and the installation of a cooperative replacement is presented as Assyrian administrative action. On the precise question of who initiated the transfer of power and how it was formalized, the 2 records describe the same event in the same institutional terms from different vantage points, in different languages, with different audiences. The skeptical argument requires that the specific names, specific actions, and specific political contexts all appear in Assyrian records by coincidence while still being literary inventions. Number 7. Ahab. Around 1861, George Taylor, the British consul operating in eastern Turkey, was traveling near the village of Kirk in what is now the Diyarbakir province when local guides directed him to a large basalt stele standing in the open rubble of an ancient site. The stele was approximately 2.2 meters tall. The face presented toward Taylor was polished and covered in tight cuneiform script, with carved relief images in the upper section showing a helmeted king in military posture. The opposite face, which had been facing away from prevailing weather, was in better condition. Taylor arranged its transport to London. But what the Kirk monolith named Ahab doing, and what the biblical text's silence on the same event revealed, would make this confirmation unlike any other in the Assyrian record. The stele commemorates the military campaigns of Shalmaneser III, the same Assyrian king whose black obelisk shows Jehu bowing in tribute. But the Kirk monolith records an earlier period of Shalmaneser's reign, specifically his campaigns in the region of Syria and the northern Levant. The most significant entry for biblical archaeology is the account of the Battle of Karkar, fought in 853 BC at the Orontes River in northern Syria. Shalmaneser records that he faced a coalition of 12 kings. The 6th name in the coalition list is Aha-ab Busar-Elah, Ahab the Israelite. The inscription credits him with contributing 2,000 chariots and 10,000 foot soldiers to the anti-Assyrian alliance. 2,000 chariots. In the coalition force Shalmaneser describes, no other nation contributed more chariots. Hadadezer of Damascus brought 1,200. Ben-Hadad's forces, often treated in the biblical text as the dominant regional power, fielded fewer chariots than Ahab of Israel. The Kirk monolith presents Ahab as the single largest chariot power in a coalition that held Shalmaneser III to what his own annals describe, obliquely, as an incomplete victory. The truly disturbing aspect is not the confirmation. It's what the Bible does not say. The Battle of Karkar, 853 BCE, is not in the biblical text. There is no account in 1 or 2 Kings of Ahab commanding 2,000 chariots alongside a regional coalition against an Assyrian advance. 1 Kings 20 and 22 record Ahab's wars with Aram his ally at Karkar and his eventual death at Ramoth Gilead. The text says nothing about Karkar. The battle in which Ahab appears to have commanded the largest chariot force in the region was not considered worth recording in the Hebrew chronicle of his reign. The Assyrian record confirms Ahab's existence, his military capacity, and his political standing as one of the most significant rulers in the region. It also confirms something the biblical text does not preserve, that Ahab fought at Karkar. The confirmation and the omission arrive in the same document. The contrast is sharpest in how the biblical portrait actually reads. 1 Kings devotes more chapters to Ahab than to almost any other northern king: his marriage to Jezebel, the introduction of Baal worship at the capital, the killing of Naboth for his vineyard, the confrontations with Elijah, the prophecies of his death in battle. The text's own summary places him above every previous Israelite king in the measure of divine provocation. The Kirk monolith records him differently. In the administrative vocabulary of the most powerful empire in the ancient Near East, Ahab was not primarily the king who married a Phoenician princess and erected a Baal temple in Samaria. He was Aha Abusar Elah, the Israelite, who arrived at the Orontes River with 2,000 chariots, the single largest chariot contribution in the entire coalition, the military force that helped hold Shalmaneser III to what his own annals describe as an incomplete resolution. 2,000 chariots required iron, trained horses, maintenance logistics, administrative capacity, the kind of military infrastructure that the biblical text, concentrated entirely on Ahab's theological failures and prophetic confrontations, provides almost no account of. The Kirk monolith records a military apparatus operating at a regional scale the Hebrew chronicle never describes. The same king appears in both records. They do not contradict each other. They simply recorded different dimensions of the same man, and what Ahab's enemy preserved was the dimension his own tradition did not consider worth noting. The Kirk monolith is in the British Museum. The battle it records took place in 853 BCE. The coalition Ahab joined to what military purpose, with what consequences for the northern kingdom, under what political circumstances the Hebrew chronicle does not say. The Assyrian stele names him there. The text that bears his name for 34 chapters does not. Number 6, Baruch Ben Neriah. In the mid-1970s, a clay seal impression appeared on the Jerusalem Antiquities Market. It was roughly 1 centimeter in diameter, the size of a human thumbnail impressed from a small oval signet into a clay lump of the kind used to seal documents before the age of wax and ribbon. The clay had been fired. Not deliberately, not in a kiln set for the purpose, but in the destruction of whatever building it had been stored in. The fire baked it permanent. It had survived approximately 2,600 years in the ground. The collector, Shlomo Musayef, acquired it in Jerusalem. Naaman Avigad epigrapher, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the most precise reader of ancient Hebrew seals in his generation, examined it and published his identification in the Israel Exploration Journal in 1978. Avigad had spent decades reading ancient personal seals. He knew the standard formulas: the owner's name, the patronymic, occasionally a title. The title on this seal was the detail he recognized immediately. The inscription read, El Berkihu ben Rihu Spur, belonging to Barak Yahu son of Neriyahu the scribe, Ha-Sopher, the scribe, Barak Yahu son of Neriyahu, Baruch son of Neriah. Jeremiah chapter 36 verse 4. Jeremiah called Baruch son of Neriah. And Baruch wrote from Jeremiah's dictation all the words the Lord had spoken to him. Jeremiah 36 and 45 describe Baruch as the man who physically transcribed Jeremiah's prophecies, read them aloud in the temple courts, preserved the scroll when the king burned the first copy, and ultimately carried the record of Jeremiah's entire prophetic career. Without Baruch's scribal work, the book of Jeremiah as the canonical text contains it would not exist. His seal survived because the building it was in was destroyed. The Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC baked the clay permanent. Baruch's seal was preserved by the catastrophe it was meant to outlast. But here's where the evidentiary weight shifts in a way that is difficult to categorize. Baruch ben Neriah is not a king. He is not a general or a high official or a monument builder. He is a scribe specifically, the private secretary of a prophet. His role in the biblical narrative is functional. He copies, he reads aloud, he carries the scroll. There is no political reason to invent him. He holds no throne, commands no army, controls no temple income. He is the most ordinary kind of figure in ancient administration, a literate professional in service to someone else. The existence of his seal confirms that he existed. More than that, it confirms the specific institutional status the biblical text assigns him. Hasofer, the title pressed into the clay, is the exact designation Jeremiah 36 uses. A title on a seal is not a literary flourish. It is an administrative declaration inscribed for practical use, compressed into 1 centimeter of clay, pressed into documents to identify the sender. On the reverse of the bulla, pressed into the clay before it was fired, before the city burned, before the document it sealed was lost, there is a fingerprint. The fingerprint has never been matched to any other object in the ancient Near Eastern record. It is human. It was made by whoever pressed the seal into the clay when the document was sealed. Whether it belongs to the hand that transcribed the book of Jeremiah cannot be established. It cannot be ruled out. Baruch's role in the biblical narrative extends further than a single scroll. Jeremiah chapter 45 contains a brief personal oracle, 4 verses addressed to Baruch directly, in his own name, not as a proclamation to Israel, but as a word from the Lord to the scribe himself. The text records that Baruch had said, "Woe to me! The Lord has added sorrow to my pain. I am worn out with groaning and find no rest." The oracle replies, "Do not seek great things for yourself. Seek them not. I will bring disaster on all people. But wherever you go, I will let you escape with your life." It is the only place in the Hebrew prophetic corpus where a scribe receives a divine word addressed specifically to him as an individual, rather than as an instrument of transmission. It is personal, spare, and recorded without elaboration. And it exists in the book of Jeremiah only because someone preserved it. The book ends with the material Baruch transcribed and carried. The oracle in chapter 45 is the document that records the cost of the transcription, the evidence that the person doing the preservation was afraid, was exhausted, and was told by the text he was preserving that the best he could expect was survival. The bulla with the fingerprint confirms that Baruch was a real person with a real administrative function in a real city during the final years of that city's existence. The oracle in Jeremiah 45 confirms that someone considered the state of the scribe worth recording. One piece of evidence is clay, one is text. Both describe the same function, a literate professional in a burning city whose work outlasted the fire. The fingerprint is approximately 2,600 years old. It sits on the reverse of a seal impression that may have passed through the hand of the man who preserved a prophet's words from a fire, then survived that fire, and now sits in a museum case. Number 5. Nebo Sarsekim. In 2007, Michael Jersa, an Assyriologist at the University of Vienna, was working through a collection of Babylonian administrative tablets held at the British Museum, a routine research visit of the kind that produces small findings and occasional footnotes. The tablets he was examining that day were from the Neo-Babylonian period, acquired by the museum during the late 19th century through excavations and purchases that brought thousands of cuneiform objects to London. Most had been catalogued. Few had been read in full. The tablet Jersa reached that day was designated BM 114789. It was small palm-sized and contained a routine financial transaction record, a gold donation to the Esagila, the great temple of Marduk in Babylon, dated to the 10th year of Nebuchadnezzar II, approximately 595 BCE. The donor's name and title were given in full as administrative convention required. The donor was identified as Nabu-Sharusu Ukin, chief eunuch of Nebuchadnezzar's court. Jersa recognized the name. He went to Jeremiah chapter 39 verse 3. Jeremiah 39 records the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. In verse 3, as Nebuchadnezzar's army enters the city, a list of Babylonian officials is given the commanders and officers who took up positions in the middle gate of Jerusalem as the siege concluded. Among them, Nebo-Sarsekim, the chief officer, Nabu-Sharusu Uken-Rab Shareshi, chief eunuch, the same name, the same title. A man confirmed in a financial record from the Babylon temple treasury 9 years before the fall of Jerusalem was among the officials the book of Jeremiah places at the gate of the conquered city. What makes this particularly dread-inducing is not the confirmation itself. It's the circumstance of its concealment. BM 114789 had been in the British Museum's possession since the latter half of the 19th century, acquired during the same excavation campaigns that filled the Assyrian and Babylonian galleries. For nearly a century and a quarter, it sat in the collection. Scholars debated whether the officials named in Jeremiah 39 were historical figures or literary constructions inserted to lend authenticity to a theological narrative. The debate proceeded in the reading rooms and lecture halls of British universities. The answer was in the storage cabinets 3 floors below. Irving Finkel of the British Museum confirmed Jersa's identification. The Babylonian tablet is a temple donation record, not a military document. It was not created to describe the fall of Jerusalem. It was created because a court official was making a routine religious contribution in 595 BCE. His name and title were recorded because that is what administrative temple records do. The administrative system of Babylon generated a document that, 9 years later, would place the same official at the gate of a city his king was destroying. The British Museum had this tablet in its collection for more than 120 years. It holds approximately 130,000 objects. The cuneiform collection alone contains tens of thousands of tablets. In 2007, Michael Jersa reached BM 14789 and read the name that had been sitting in the building the entire time. No announcement had been issued. No separate investigation into the officials named in Jeremiah 39 had been funded as a consequence of the collection's holdings. The tablet had not been published. The scholars debating the historicity of that chapter's named figures had not been informed that their question had a documentary answer already housed in the institution where several of them worked. The implications extend beyond Nebo-Sarsekim specifically. Jeremiah chapter 39 verses 3 and 13 list multiple Babylonian officials by name in connection with the fall of Jerusalem. The standard critical position held that such name lists were literary devices, artificial, authenticating detail added by a later editor to give the account the texture of historical record. This position had been maintained long enough to become institutionalized in the commentary tradition. The BM 114789 tablet does not confirm every name in those lists, but it confirms one of them with complete precision. Same name, same title, same king's court, same period. The mechanism that would explain away the Nebo-Sarsekim confirmation coincidental name match, scribal invention, later editorial insertion, must now also account for why the supposedly invented name appears with the correct administrative title in the correct document type from the correct imperial court. An invented name, placed for verisimilitude by a later editor, would require that editor to have known not just the name, but the precise title its bearer held in Nebuchadnezzar's administrative hierarchy. Jersa described the discovery, in a published interview after the identification as the kind of find that occurs perhaps once in a generation. He did not say this because the tablet contained dramatic content. A gold donation to a temple is not dramatic. He said it because a routine administrative record had produced the cleanest documentary bridge between the British Museum's cuneiform holdings and a specific verse of the Hebrew Bible that anyone had seen in decades. BM 114789 is now published. The name on it has been confirmed. The official at Jerusalem's gate in 586 BC paid his temple dues 9 years early, in the correct city, under the correct king, with the correct title, and left a record that sat in a London cabinet for a century while the discussion around him continued. Number 4. Jehoiachin. In 1939, Ernst Friedrich Weidner, a German cuneiformist and historian of the ancient Near East, was working through a set of administrative tablets at the Vorderasiya Tisches Museum in Berlin. The tablets had been excavated decades earlier, during Robert Koldewe's systematic excavation of Babylon for the Deutsche Orient-Gesellschaft between 1899 and 1917. They had been transported to Berlin, catalogued, and largely set aside. They were ration lists' monthly distributions of oil, grain, and livestock to foreign workers, craftsmen, envoys, and prisoners held in or around Nebuchadnezzar's royal compound. Administrative records from a palace storeroom. Routine documentation of the imperial maintenance apparatus. Weidner was 37 entries into the primary tablet when he encountered entry 17. The cuneiform text read, 10 sila for Yakin, king of the land of Yahudu. He would have recognized both the name and the designation, Yakin, a Babylonian rendering of the Hebrew Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Yahudu, Judah. Entry 18 immediately followed, 2.5 sila for the 5 sons of the king of Yahudu, Jehoiachin and his 5 sons. Listed consecutively in a Babylonian palace ration allocation dated to the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II. Weidner published his finding in the Melanges Syrians offered to Rendusau in Paris that same year. The article was titled Jojachin, König von Judah, in Babylonischen Kehlschrifttexten Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in Babylonian cuneiform texts. The identification was unambiguous and immediately accepted. 2 Kings chapter 24 verses 12 through 15 record Nebuchadnezzar's first siege of Jerusalem in 597 BCE, the surrender of Jehoiachin, his deportation to Babylon along with his mother, his court, his officials, and his fighting men. 2 Kings chapter 25 verses 27 through 29 record a later event. Evil Merodach, Nebuchadnezzar's son and successor, released Jehoiachin from prison, spoke kindly to him, gave him a throne above those of the other captive kings in Babylon, and provided him a regular allowance for the rest of his life. The Weidner tablets are documents from the period between those two events. Jehoiachin is in Babylon, alive, receiving rations. His 5 sons are receiving half rations. He has not yet been elevated by evil Merodach. He is somewhere in the administrative middle, a captive king, maintained at royal expense, listed without ceremony between other foreign nationals in the distribution record. What makes this archive disturbing is not the confirmation that he existed. It is the texture of his captivity. The tablets list dozens of foreign workers and prisoners craftsmen from Egypt, envoys from Philistia, hostages from various territories. Jehoiachin's entry is not marked differently from the surrounding lines. He receives 10 liters of oil per month. His 5 sons receive 2.5 liters each. The king of Judah is a line item in a bureaucratic oil distribution. The last king of the Davidic line to sit on Jerusalem's throne before the exile occupies the same tablet as craftsmen and workers, distinguished only by the title the Babylonian record still grants him, king of Yahudu. The retention of that title in a palace ration record has specific historical weight. Nebuchadnezzar had installed Zedekiah Jehoiachin's uncle on the throne in Jerusalem. By the political logic of the Babylonian Empire, Jehoiachin was deposed, politically superseded, a captive maintained at royal expense with no functional authority. There was no administrative reason to continue calling him king. Other deposed rulers held in Babylonian custody were sometimes listed in ration records by personal name without royal designation. The Babylonian clerk who wrote entry 17 either had specific instructions to maintain the title or treated it as Jehoiakin's established administrative identity within the palace, compound the designation under which he had been received. The category under which he was filed, the title that traveled with him from Jerusalem. The detail resonates because both the Babylonian administrative system and the Hebrew scribal tradition continued to regard Jehoiakin as the legitimate Davidic incumbent. The prophetic literature of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the genealogies and chronicles, and the regnal framework of 2 Kings all calculate years relative to Jehoiachin's exile, not to Zedekiah's accession, not to the installation of the replacement ruler, but to the deportation of the man the Babylonian ration list still calls king of Yehudu. Two different institutional traditions, operating by entirely different logics, arrived at the same designation for the same man at the same time. The man Babylon was feeding in a palace storeroom ration allocation 10 liters of oil per month. 5 sons listed beneath his name was, in the accounting of both the empire that imprisoned him and the tradition that preserved him, still the king. The accounts in 2 Kings had Jehoiachin deported to Babylon. The Widener tablets have him in Babylon, receiving rations, with his 5 sons listed beneath his name. The two records confirm each other with the specificity of administrative cross-referencing. The tablets are still in Berlin, at the Staatliche Museen. Entry 17 still allocates 10 liters of oil to Joachim, king of the land of Yehudu. Entry 18 still names his 5 sons beneath him. The Babylonian administrator who wrote those entries had no reason to know that the ration record would be read in a Berlin museum 2,500 years later by a scholar who recognized a name from a text he had studied in school. Number 3. Nebuchadnezzar. Robert Koldewey arrived at the Mound of Babylon in March 1899 as the director of the Deutsche Orientgesellschaft's excavation project, a systematic, funded, multi-decade campaign to recover the physical remains of the greatest city of the ancient world. His team would work the site for 18 years. Among the first things they documented, repeated across every major structure they uncovered, was a detail that required no translation: the baked bricks. Every major building at Babylon, the walls, the Ishtar Gate, the Processional Way, the Southern Palace. The foundations of the Itamananki ziggurat yielded bricks stamped before firing with the same inscription. The stamp was pressed into the unfired clay so that the letters stood raised against the brick face after kiln firing, still legible after 2,500 years in the desert soil. The inscription, translated from Babylonian cuneiform, identified the builder, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, M.I. The declaration repeated on tens of thousands of individual bricks. The man who built Babylon had signed every stone. But what the Babylonian Chronicle recorded for Nebuchadnezzar's 7th year, and what it recorded with a precision that would not be fully published for another half-century, was something different from a construction legacy. It was a date. The Babylonian Chronicle, covering 605 to 594 BCE, is preserved on a single clay tablet held at the British Museum, designated BM 2019-46. Donald Wiseman of the British Museum published it in 1956 under the title Chronicles of Chaldean Kings. The tablet is administrative historiography dry, formulaic, year-by-year recording of military actions and their outcomes. For Nebuchadnezzar's 7th year, the entry reads as follows: The king of Babylon mustered his army and marched to the Hatti land, encamped against the city of Judah, and on the 2nd day of the month Adaru, captured the city and seized the king. He appointed a king of his own choice, received its tribute, and sent them to Babylon. The 2nd day of Adaru in Nebuchadnezzar's 7th year corresponds to the 16th of March, 597 BCE. 2 Kings chapter 24, verses 10 through 17, describe Nebuchadnezzar's siege of Jerusalem, the surrender of King Jehoiachin, the deportation of the royal court and the skilled workers, the installation of Zedekiah as a puppet ruler. The narrative gives no calendar date. It gives the sequence of events. The Babylonian Chronicle gives the calendar date. It gives no narrative interpretation. It records a military action in the administrative language of an empire recording its own operations. The pivot is not the confirmation that Nebuchadnezzar existed. His stamped bricks make that redundant across every square meter of Babylon's excavated surface. The pivot is the calendar date. The second day of Adaru, seventh year, is a precision that the Hebrew text never achieved and never needed to achieve. A military action that 2 Kings describes in terms of its theological significance and its institutional consequences, the end of Jehoiakim's reign. The beginning of Zedekiah's, the thinning of Jerusalem's population, is recorded in a Babylonian administrative tablet with a calendar date that places the event on a specific Wednesday in March. Two traditions recorded the same event. One recorded what it meant, the other recorded when it happened. Neither account copies the other. Both describe the same day. The Babylonian Chronicle's calendar precision has a specific consequence for biblical chronology that is easy to understate. The Hebrew text of 2 Kings has been subject to ongoing scholarly debate about its internal dating. The regnal years of the kings of Israel and Judah do not always synchronize cleanly, and the chronological framework of the monarchic period is complex enough that scholars have spent generations working out its internal logic. The Babylonian Chronicle does not resolve those internal complexities. What it provides is an external anchor, a fixed point in absolute chronology against which events recorded in the biblical text can be precisely measured. March 16th, 597 BCE. That date derived from the Babylonian calendar entry for the second day of Adaru in Nebuchadnezzar's 7th year is now one of the primary anchor points in the absolute chronology of the biblical period. Events that the biblical text dates relative to this event: the length of Jehoiakim's deportation, the years of Zedekiah's reign, the dated prophetic activity of Ezekiel, whose visions are systematically recorded relative to Jehoiakim's exile, can be anchored to an actual calendar because a Babylonian administrative clerk wrote a specific date in a routine military record. The chronicle covering 605 to 594 BC was purchased by the British Museum in 1896 and sat in the collection for 60 years before Wiseman published it in 1956. The section recording the events of 597 BC is complete, the calendar date intact and legible. The section that would record the calendar date for 586 BC, the final siege, the temple's destruction, survives on a different fragmentary tablet. The relevant date column is damaged. The archive preserved one date with complete precision. It could not preserve the other. The chronicle covering 605 to 594 BC survived as a single tablet purchased by the British Museum in 1896. The section on 597 BC is intact, the calendar date preserved. The section covering 586 BC, when the temple was destroyed and Jerusalem was burned, survives on a different fragmentary tablet. The date of the temple's destruction is not preserved with the same precision. The archive has one complete date and one that is missing, and they correspond exactly to the two events whose historicity has been most contested. Number 2. Cyrus the Great. In February 1879, Hormuzd Rassam, an Assyrian-born archaeologist working on behalf of the British Museum, was directing excavations in the ruins of the Isagila, the great temple complex of Marduk at Babylon, the theological center of the Babylonian Empire. In the foundation deposits beneath the floor of the inner sanctuary, his crew uncovered a clay cylinder. It was approximately 22.5 centimeters long, rounded at both ends, slightly heavier than it looked. The surface was covered in 45 lines of tight cuneiform script in the Babylonian dialect. Rassam wrapped it and shipped it to London. What the cylinder's text recorded about Cyrus's policy, and what a different text, written in a different language, attributed to a prophet who wrote centuries earlier, had already said about that policy, would make it one of the most argued over artifacts in the history of religious scholarship. The Cyrus Cylinder, British Museum BM 90920, is the official proclamation of Cyrus II of Persia, issued after his conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE. The cylinder records the theological framing. The god Marduk, displeased with Nabonidus, called Cyrus to liberate Babylon. It records the military event: Cyrus entered Babylon without a battle, and the city received him in peace. And it records a policy. Cyrus ordered the repatriation of displaced peoples to their homelands and the restoration of their gods and sanctuaries. I returned to their sacred cities across the Tigris, the sanctuaries of which have been ruins for a long time. I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned to them their habitations. Ezra chapter 1 verses 1 through 4 records Cyrus issuing a decree. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem and Judah and build the temple of the Lord their God. The specific policy return the exiles, restore the sanctuary matches the cylinder's recorded policy in the language of the specific case. Then there is the Isaiah passage. Isaiah chapter 44 verse 28 names Cyrus, who says of Cyrus, "He is my shepherd and will accomplish all that I please. He will say of Jerusalem, let it be rebuilt, and of the temple, let its foundations be laid." Isaiah chapter 45 verse 1 addresses him directly as the one whose right hand the Lord takes hold of, to subdue nations before him. A specific foreign king, named with a specific commission, in a text attributed to the prophet Isaiah of Jerusalem. The scholarly consensus among critical historians is that Isaiah chapters 40 through 66 were not written by the 8th century Isaiah, but by a later author, or authors writing during or shortly after the Babylonian exile, approximately 550 to 540 BCE. Under this reading, the Cyrus naming is near contemporary prophecy, written within decades of Cyrus's rise, not centuries before it. This is the standard response to the Cyrus passage, and it should be presented fairly if chapters 40-66 were written in 550 BCE. Naming Cyrus is not inexplicable. But the Cyrus cylinder does not simply confirm that Cyrus existed. It confirms the three specific policy elements that the Isaiah text attributed to him: peaceful conquest, restoration of exiles to their homelands, and the specific rebuilding of sanctuaries. Whether the Isaiah text was written in 740 BC or 550 BC, whoever wrote it described a foreign king's behavior with a precision that the king's own official proclamation, issued by Cyrus himself, confirms entirely. There is a third text worth placing alongside the cylinder and the Isaiah passage. Ezra chapter 6 records that when Darius I searched the imperial archives at Ecbatana, his officials found a memorandum, the original Cyrus decree, regarding the Jerusalem temple, specifying the temple's dimensions, the funding source for its reconstruction, and the instruction to return the gold and silver vessels Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Jerusalem. 3 texts, 3 genres, 3 languages. The Babylonian cylinder is Akkadian royal propaganda, written for temple priests in Marduk's religious vocabulary. The Ezra Memorandum is an Aramaic administrative record filed at a Persian imperial archive. The Isaiah passage is Hebrew prophetic literature transmitted through the Babylonian exile. Each describes the same policy executed by the same king. None was written for the same audience. None was created to corroborate the others. 3 independent institutional systems, operating in different languages for different purposes, all recorded a foreign king's behavior toward the Jewish exile with enough consistency that the British Museum's 1879 acquisition could be placed alongside texts the tradition had preserved for centuries and found to describe the same person doing the same thing. For that convergence to be coincidental, the coincidence must extend not just to the existence of the king, but to his specific behavioral policy. Not just to the policy in general, but to the application of that policy specifically to the Jewish exiles in Babylon. The cylinder was not written for Jewish readers. It was a Babylonian temple document recording Cyrus's legitimacy in the religious vocabulary of Marduk's priests. The Ezra account records the Jewish-specific application of the same policy. The Isaiah text names the king who would execute it. The Great Isaiah Scroll 1Q Isa A, found at Qumran in 1947 and dated by paleographic analysis to approximately 125 to 100 BC, contains the Cyrus passage with no redactional annotation, no marginal notation distinguishing chapters 44 through 45 from the surrounding text, no scribal mark to indicate a transition between authors or periods. Whatever its compositional history, The scroll that preserves the passage had been in continuous scribal transmission for at least 2 centuries before Rossum pulled the cylinder from the ground in 1879. The cylinder was in the foundation deposits of the Assyria for 2,400 years. The scroll naming the king it describes was copied and preserved by a community in the Judean desert who apparently considered the passage no different from any other line of Isaiah. The cylinder was found first. The connection to the text was made within years of its publication. Number 1. Belshazzar. In the summer of 1854, J.E. Taylor, the British consul at Basra, was excavating at Tel el-Mukayyar, a desolate mud brick mound rising from the flat southern Iraqi desert, identified by his surveys as the site of ancient Ur. Taylor was not a professional archaeologist. He was methodical and meticulous, but his training was consular. He excavated the corners of the Great Ziggurat, the massive stepped tower that dominated the site, because he had been advised that foundation deposits were typically placed at a structure's corners by the kings who built or restored it. He found them. At the corners of the ziggurat, tucked into hollow spaces in the masonry, were clay cylinders. They fit in his palm. They were small and dense, fired deliberately for permanence, covered in fine cuneiform script. Taylor could not read cuneiform. He labeled them, wrapped them, and shipped them to Henry Rawlinson at the East India Company in London. What the cylinders named would take 2 years to translate. What that translation implied would take nearly a century to fully understand. The cylinders were Nabonidus foundation dedications inscribed by Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon 555 to 539 BC, recording his restoration of the ziggurat at Ur and invoking divine protection for the project. Rawlinson identified and published the inscription. The cylinders name Nabonidus, and in a prayer formula at the end of the text, they name his son, Bel-Shar-Usur. May the gods protect his life. May his days be long. Bel-Shar-Usur, in the Hebrew rendering of a Babylonian royal name, Belshazzar. Daniel chapter 5 is among the most vivid narratives in the Hebrew Bible. Belshazzar, king of Babylon, hosts a great feast. The golden and silver vessels looted from the Jerusalem temple are brought to the table. In the middle of the feast, a hand appears and writes on the wall of the palace. The text is Aramaic, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. The king is terrified. None of his wise men can interpret the inscription. The queen reminds him of Daniel, the Jewish exile who interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. Daniel is brought in and reads the writing. The kingdom has been weighed and found wanting. It is to be given to the Medes and Persians. That same night, the text records, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was killed, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom. Before Taylor's cylinders were translated, no non-biblical source had ever mentioned Belshazzar. The standard scholarly position through most of the 19th century was that Daniel's author had made an error. The last king of Babylon was known from Greek sources Herodotus, Berossus, and from the Babylonian Chronicle as Nabonidus. Belshazzar did not appear in any known record. The critical conclusion: he was a literary invention inserted into a narrative the author set in the Babylonian period, but did not research carefully. Taylor's cylinders changed part of that. They confirmed he existed. Nabonidus had a son named Bel-Shar-Usur, identified in a royal inscription. But the objection shifted and held its ground for decades. The cylinders confirmed a prince, not a king. Daniel 5 calls Belshazzar king. The historical record showed Nabonidus as king. The designation remained an error. The confirmation of his existence, critics maintained, only sharpened the problem. Daniel's author knew a prince's name, but promoted him incorrectly to the kingship. The existence of the name proved access to partial information, and partial information, improperly applied, remained evidence of a fictional narrative. The Nabonidus Chronicle changed everything. The Nabonidus Chronicle, British Museum tablet BM 35382, was published by Sidney Smith in his 1924 volume Babylonian Historical Texts. It is a year-by-year administrative record of Nabonidus' reign. For multiple years in sequence, the Chronicle records that Nabonidus was not in Babylon. He was at Tama, an oasis in the Arabian desert, apparently engaged in religious reform activities connected to the moon god Sin. The chronicle records the same phrase for those years: the king did not come to Babylon. And it records what happened in his absence. Belshazzar, the crown prince, administered the empire. Not a prince in a ceremonial sense. An administrator with effective royal authority over the capital and its institutions during his father's extended absences. The functional king, without the formal title, because the formal title was occupied by a man who had left the building. Daniel 5:16 records Belshazzar's offer to Daniel: interpret the inscription on the wall, and you will be clothed in purple and given a gold chain, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom, not second. Third, this detail was, for nearly 2 centuries, a primary piece of evidence that Daniel was fictional. No king offers third place. A king who controls the kingdom offers second. The offer of third position was treated as a logical impossibility, the kind of error a writer makes when constructing a narrative without knowing how actual royal succession worked. Critics cited it consistently and specifically. The detail was indefensible. The Nabonidus Chronicle provides the explanation. Nabonidus is first. He is the king, the formal holder of the Babylonian throne, absent in Arabia but not abdicated. Belshazzar is second, the crown prince, the acting regent, the man conducting the feast in the palace that Darius the Mede's army was at that moment approaching. The highest position Belshazzar can offer is third, because the second position is already his, because the first position belongs to his father in Tema. The detail that critics deployed for nearly 2 centuries as evidence that Daniel's author invented a fictional king is, on the accumulated evidence of the Nabonidus Foundation cylinders and the Nabonidus Chronicle, the most historically precise detail in the chapter. This reversal has a specific architecture that runs through the entire Belshazzar case. Each stage of the scholarly engagement with Daniel 5 produced an objection that the next discovery did not simply eliminate, but recontextualized, and the recontextualization required the full set of evidence assembled across 70 years to complete. Taylor's cylinders established the name a prince, confirmed as real, but the kingship designation remained in error. The Chronicle established that Belshazzar functioned as effective administrator of the empire during his father's extended absences. The kingship was real within the political structure of the late Babylonian court, even without the formal title. And the third highest ruler offer deployed for nearly 2 centuries as the clinching evidence of fictional composition. Because a real king offers second place, not third, became, in the light of the Chronicle's data, the clinching evidence of historical precision. Nabonidus holds first, Belshazzar holds second. Therefore, the highest position Belshazzar can offer is third. The objection required the Chronicle to refute. The Chronicle supplied the refutation without knowing what it was answering. Someone who encountered Taylor's cylinders without access to the Chronicle could reasonably maintain the prince, not king objection. Someone who encountered the Chronicle without the cylinders could establish the co-regency structure, but would lack the confirmation of Belshazzar's personal name in a royal inscription. The Belshazzar case requires both documents together, separated by 70 years of separate excavation and scholarship. The convergence was not arranged. It accumulated. What makes the Belshazzar case foundation shaking is not the confirmation that he existed. It's the correction. The scholars who identified the third highest ruler as a logical impossibility were right that it was logically impossible for a king. They were wrong about who was making the offer. The Nabonidus Chronicle, published in 1924, 70 years after Taylor's cylinders arrived in London, established the political structure of the Babylonian court on the night of the feast with enough precision to answer the objection entirely. The detail that proved Daniel wrong was the detail that required the most intimate knowledge of Babylonian court politics to get exactly right. Across this script, enemy monuments have named Israelite kings conducting battles the biblical text never recorded. Administrative tablets from a palace storeroom have listed a captive king's name and his sons in an oil distribution ledger. A Babylonian chronicle has supplied a calendar date for the worst siege in Jerusalem's history. None of those confirmations required resolving a 2-century scholarly objection by revealing that the objection itself was the proof. The Nabonidus Foundation cylinders are in the British Museum. They were found at Ur by a British consul who could not read them, shipped to a scholar who could, and translated in 1856. The prayer at the end names Belshazzar User and asks the gods to protect his days. The prayer was not answered. The name survived. And the detail inscribed in a text that used his name as evidence of its own unreliability turned out to be the detail that required knowing, on the night of the feast, exactly who was sitting at the table and what his father had left him. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.